Hey, everybody, welcome back. It's Thursday. We're one day closer to the weekend. That's a good thing. I'm your host, Greg Avola. Thanks for joining our virtual happy hour on this lovely Thursday evening. I'm going to bring in my guest today, Andy Crouch. Andy, thank you so much for being part of it. You're the co-founder and publisher of Beer Edge. Thanks for being part of the show.
Yeah, we're happy to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Very exciting stuff. It's always interesting when you were on someone else's show in the podcast that you interviewed me, and now we're flipping it around where I'm interviewing you. So the power's in my spot this time, Andy. Remember that. So
I'm hoping that I was reasonably gentle the last time, so this won't pop off into some bad direction, trying to get some kind of revenge. So I'm looking forward to it.
Sounds good. Well, before we get all the details, obviously with our virtual happy hour, we got a drink, and that is the great part about what we're trying to accomplish, bringing the physical happy hour to the virtual setting. So I'll let you go first, Andy. What are you drinking on your side this evening?
I'm drinking an old favorite tonight. I'm drinking a little bit old school. It fits the season, even though a lot of folks are probably not too excited about moving into the fall season. Drinking the old standby of Victory Fest beer. I've been drinking a fair amount of Oktoberfest lately. One of my favorite styles. I wish I'm not somebody who cares too much about style creep. I wish that Oktoberfest and Märzen's were available year round. Sadly, they're not. But I've been drinking a lot of German versions, much lighter style. This is a sort of more the Americanized Oktoberfest, dark color, beautiful, some lightly roasted flavors and just a lot of malt. So it's a beautiful time of year to be a lover of great lager, and this Victory certainly hits all those numbers.
Fantastic. Yes. It's always interesting to see those seasonal creep messages come across when people walk into their favorite grocery stores and see that big pile of, Sam Adams Oktoberfest at the end of July, early August, and people get all up in arms about them. But I'm with you. I'm a huge fan of that style. And I think if they could do it full time, all the time, I definitely would drink it all the time. But
I think we just need to get away. We just need to stop calling it seasonal creep. Really, what people are complaining about is pumpkin beer. That's it's like the code word. That's what they're talking about. It's fine. You want to crap on pumpkin beer? I say drink what you like, but keep your hands off my Oktoberfest. I'm here for it year round.
I like it. Well, I'm drinking a local favorite here. This is Fat Orange Cat. This one is a crazy name. She drives a Plymouth Satellite. I picked this up at Total Wine a little while ago. And it's a New England IPA. I believe it's around 7%. Fat Orange Cat is a really great brewery in Connecticut. It's out of the owner's house, and you actually have an open air drive-through that you go in to pick up your beers from that place. So it's a really cool little place. In the pre-COVID days, there'd be fire pits, and they'd be walk-in coolers that are turned into kind of more of a sit thing. So it's a really cool place. So I'm excited to try this beer out there as well. So if you're out there and you got your beer ready to go, let's crack it open. Make sure you're checking in your beer and Untapped as well. And also using the Untapped at Home venue. It's a great way to show all the people that you're being safe out there, and also being home and checking in. You can see all your friends drinking as well, and also see some really cool stats on the top beers and things like that. So I raise my glass to you, Eddie. Thank you so much for being part of the show. And for you all out there,
cheers.
Cheers, everybody. That is good. If you can't see through the beer, it means it's very, very good. So let's get right into it here. Obviously, we talked a little bit about, you do a lot of podcast stuff, and I was on your podcast, Beer Edge, earlier. But tell us how you got started in the industry and what your early journalism days looked like in the beer world from that perspective.
Sure. I'm one of the most boring people you're ever going to meet, because I actually do for a living exactly, what I was trained for. So I went to journalism for undergrad, got a journalism degree, specifically in magazine journalism. That's what I do still to this day, basically, except most magazines have gone away. We've moved online. But I'm also an attorney. So I do both of those things, a little bit of an even split between them. But I have covered craft beer for about 20 years now. I think it was actually 20 years as of May, not to date myself too much. So I've seen a lot of ups, a lot of downs. I remember when, for me, it was the typical, story of getting into beer, where I was, abroad for a semester and went down to the local pub in London and had my first Guinness and was like, this doesn't taste like anything like, the junk I'm drinking in college. And so the next weekend I jumped on a cheap flight to Dublin and went on my first brewery tour, which is at Guinness. And came back and was just like, this stuff is great. I want to tell my friends about it. In the town where I went to school, a local brew pub had opened up, and they were flooding campus with free beer coins. So we figured, we'd all go down there, have a couple beers. And I had a stout down there called the Black Hawk Stout. Shout out to the Court Avenue Brewing Company in Des Moines, Iowa. And it didn't taste like Guinness, and so I just couldn't understand what this magic, this voodoo was, that these beers that basically everything had tasted the same, it tasted completely different. So it really opened my eyes. And as a writer, we don't tend to, as a journalist, we don't tend to just do a general beat. You usually pick some specific areas, and for me, beer was one of those areas. So I've been writing about it ever since. It's a fascinating topic filled with fascinating people with incredible stories to tell. I've traveled the globe to meet with people, and it's never been a boring moment. And along the way, you get to drink some absolutely fantastic beer. So it's a pretty good deal.
Absolutely. I mean, that, that's one of the things where, I've always thought of your work as storytelling. And I think that a lot of journalism in the industry of a beer can talk about certain things. One of the things that I've always appreciated from your style is how you've wrapped it into more of a story, and everything's not just a breaking news here and there kind of thing, but it's always a certain element that you put together that makes it really interesting. So definitely appreciate your backstory there. But not only, you write for publications here, as you mentioned, but you're also an author, and you've written a couple books, specifically the one that I get drawn to, being a New Englander, is the Good Beer Guide to New England. And talk us about how you got in from just a journalism perspective and moving into a book, and the differences between those two things when you're writing for it.
Sure. So when I moved to I'm originally from Chicago, and spent a lot of time in the Midwest going to school. Moved out here, about 20 years ago, and I live just outside of Boston now. Lived in Cambridge for a long time. And when I moved out here, I didn't know much about the local beer scene, and so I was kind of getting to know it. And New England, unlike where I grew up in Chicago, you drive 5 hours from Chicago and you've barely made a dent into Wisconsin or other states. You're 5 hours. You're north of Montreal, so you can get almost anywhere in New England pretty easily. So I started traveling around through Vermont and New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Maine, and getting to know the brewers there and the beer scenes. And I thought, I'd like to write a book. I wanted to write a book as one of my goals. And so, in that time, in days long before, the dark days long before Untapped, and really in sort of early days of Beer Advocate, where I was more prevalent, we just didn't, a lot of things were still done in print, and these print books were it was long before Google Maps. Damn, I wish I had Google Maps when I was planning that trip. Literally, like our hand, mapping out everything. That's how long ago that was. But so I ended up writing this book. But at that time, there were. Can you guess how many? So this is 2005, 2006. Can you guess how many breweries there were in New England?
In New England overall, including
Yep, all 6 New England states.
It's hard to say. Maybe 100.
110.
Okay, that was pretty close.
110 breweries, and now I think there are more than double that in Massachusetts alone.
Yeah.
So it was a lot easier. I think that book would be pretty near impossible to write now, and while a lot of fun, you'd be doing it for years. And frankly, beer books don't usually sell that well, so you're lucky if you make your advance back. But that book was a lot of fun. Had a really, really good time doing it, and I got introduced to almost everybody in the New England beer scene. So as somebody who was just getting into writing, there was no better opportunity to sort of learn all of their stories. And these are now people I've known for forever, and their kids have gone on to start breweries, or other friends have gone on to start breweries, and so you can stay pretty hooked in with them. But I've written, as you note, a couple of books. They're now pretty dusty and out of date, but some still available. But I've also done a lot of writing. I've written about business topics. I've written about legal topics with some of my background. I wrote a column for Beer Advocate magazine for the length that, from issue 1 to the very last issue. And that was more just opinion, which is also where I'm pretty comfortable as well. That's one of my things I'm somewhat known for, is having some stronger opinions in an industry that tends to just pat each other on the back and just be perfectly happy with things. I like to stir it up a little bit.
Yeah, I like that. I was going to comment that you're always asking the right questions and not just trying to, pat on the back like you mentioned. But yes, it's all good from that perspective there. If you joined us late, we're talking with Andy Crouch, who's the co-founder and publisher of The Beer Edge. This is a fun opportunity for me, being a good friend of Andy, is I get to put him in the hot seat now. So I'm asking you guys out there to ask some questions on your platform, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. We'd love to put some of those questions up on the board and ask some questions about Andy, about really anything in the beer industry. You've heard him before. He's been around for a very long time for this. Maybe it's a New England-based question or more of a generic-based question. We'd love to hear from you guys. So want to definitely have a shout out there for asking questions. Let's put some good ones up here to start from, let's see here. Let's see what we can pick a good one. There's a lot of questions here. Here's a good one here from Max. Any memorable breweries you've been to in Rhode Island?
No, Rhode Island's terrible. You shouldn't go there. Move on from that. Rhode Island's kind of an interesting state because it's one where craft brewing has, I mean, obviously it's such a small state. It's one where craft brewing took a while to develop. And even over the years, Connecticut was actually another one, but Connecticut has really come on strong in recent years. I remember going down there when I was writing that book, and there really wasn't a Connecticut brewery, one that defined the entire state. Troutbrook back then was kind of a big one. But in Rhode Island, for me, and it's just sort of one of those things, and I've always said, I think Narragansett, even though it was largely a contract brand, I always kind of liked Narragansett's beers. Like the main lager doesn't really do much for me, but the smaller batch stuff, including they make a fest beer that's actually really good and is super cheap. And they were doing the 16-ounce tall boy pounder cans long before any craft brewery got onto that. So I have a little bit of an affinity for the older, historic brands. And so, while that may not be the most popular thing with sort of craft beer nerds and these days, I take a look at some of those. They make also a really great, seasonal Maibach in the spring. That's good. So don't sleep on some of these old brewers. And right now they're getting ready to ramp up and open a tap room in Providence. So maybe they're going to do some more interesting stuff down there.
I also would say Gray Sail is another one that I like in Rhode Island as well. It's an interesting tap room. It's like a house, from what I recall, and you can have a beer in a dining room or what have you. It's a very old school house there. But Captain's Daughter is a great beer from what they make as well. So that'd be my pick from a memorable brewery that I've been to Rhode Island here. Let's go to another question here. This one is an international one. Andy, have you ever been to Finland? The modern craft beer genre is about to explode, hitting new heights. Any comments on that and from beers overseas in Finland?
I have actually not had the opportunity to go to Finland or actually to Scandinavia outside of Denmark. I was in Denmark, quite some time ago, back when Sean Hill was actually brewing there. I was visiting him before he opened Hill. Came back and opened Hill. Sean's a good example of one of those guys I met. One of the people I met when I was doing that first book. I met Sean 3 weeks after he started at a brewery in northern Vermont. And the first time I met him, he was kind of a shy kid who had just kind of come out of the kitchen to take over when the two brewers had quit. And he was really excited about putting chocolate into a porter. So this is old school Sean Hill. But in terms of like Finland, this is that Scandinavian scene. Whether it's Sweden or Norway or Denmark, has always been far more advanced than most in sort of the modern American craft beer style than almost anyone in the UK, certainly Germany, most of continental Europe and the Czech Republic. It's been the most American in its style, but also has a lot of this crazy, historic styles as well that are being brewed. And obviously, with their crazy fast, fast moving yeast strains that are kind of revolutionizing brewing here in the States. It's someplace I would love to spend more time, assuming we are ever allowed out of our country and our basement. I don't know if that's going to happen. So I'd like to go to Rhode Island again. I don't know if that's going to happen.
Exactly. It feels like we're all stuck in our own states, for lack of a better word, and trying to keep this coronavirus thing situated. I always like to put this comment from this individual on the screen. He's a good friend of yours and a good friend of mine. I'm not sure if you know, John Hall had made a comment here. It's, I wish there was enough time for him to wax his poetic on his love of V-neck t-shirts, but alas, the show is short. So instead, I'd love to hear his thoughts about kids in breweries. Should they be allowed among the bar stools and taps?
No, kids are sort of evil. I kind of think that they should be neither seen nor heard. Except mine's fine. He's upstairs, being reasonably quiet. I grew up in Chicago, like I said, and my parents played, my dad played in softball, 16-inch softball league, shout out to the actual only way to play real softball. None of this glove stuff. But, and so we would several times a week when I was a kid, go to the local tavern after a game. And so, I might be, they might be out for having quite a few drinks, with their friends and people from work. And so there are photos of me on top of a bar on top of a bar with just a blanket down, or on top of a gross ass pool table, like something like that. And so I have believed that these sort of third spaces, our community spaces, are places that, I think families should be allowed. I think kids should be allowed. I think breweries especially have largely built their operations around families and kids now. And you hear a lot of people online complain, and you know what? I agree with a lot of the complaints. Breweries and brewery staff and patrons are not there to police your kids. Parent your own kids. It's not a daycare. It's not like some sort of express car wash where the kids are running around and can get cleaned up. And that's not what it's there for. What it's there for is, for the family to be there, enjoy themselves in a communal environment. And I think a lot of brewery owners understand that, because they really value, frankly, the money that comes in from those families. And I think it's a great opportunity to also teach your kids respect for alcohol, which is something that my family certainly did. So I'm a big proponent of kids in those spaces, but I think there are also limits to what should happen with them, and I think there can be time limits. I don't think kids need to be there at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. I think setting limits at 5 or 6 or something like that, as long as the breweries make the rules clear, abide by them, so that somebody doesn't drive for an hour and a half with a 3-year-old and start screaming. But I take my kid up to Notch Brewing in Salem, whenever we can, and he plays around, plays a little skee ball, and enjoys petting the dogs that are out there. And I get to drink a couple of world-class lagers and in the sun, and everybody wins.
I totally agree with you, Andy. I have a 3.5-year-old myself, and I've seen a lot of breweries, like I said, become more community-related places for people to attend. And I always say that if you're not really receptive to kids from that perspective, you're going to lose out on that revenue from people like myself that are not going to find a babysitter at 1 o'clock on a Saturday to go have a few beers from that perspective there. So I've even seen some breweries in my local area have little kids areas or kitchens or something like that the kids can play with. Ultimately, with COVID-19, I don't think anyone's going to be touching those anytime soon, but I appreciate the concept to make your brewery a more of a community-driven thing. It's not like the old days where if you see a kid in a bar, it's the end of the world and you're bad parenting. It's more of a spot to kind of engage with everyone else. So I totally agree with you on that topic. It's definitely something close to my heart.
But it is really the third rail of American craft beer conversations. There are people on both sides of that are absolutely strongly viewed.
Absolutely. Here's a great question that we just popped up here. This is from Jaime, and he says, Andy, are milkshake IPAs just another fad, or they're here to stay?
There is a difference between what I wish would happen and what is likely to happen. I am somebody who, I love a West Coast style. I love every style. There's not really a style that I don't enjoy. I'm somebody who, if I was on Untapped, I'd not be giving something a 1 star just because I didn't like the style and then complain about it. I love all styles. With that said, my limits are sort of hit with sometimes with the hazy IPAs, with fruited IPAs, sour IPAs, some of these things. Unless you have a really deft hand at it, 95% of these beers taste exactly the same. And to me and my palate, that's incredibly boring. I like to see, I don't care if which hops you're putting in it, they all end up coming out looking and tasting generally the same nowadays. The secrets are long out as to how to produce these beers. With that said, they are back in the day when we could actually go out to a beer garden. If you went to Trillium or Treehouse or someplace around here in Massachusetts where I'm based and get outside, haze is all you will see. And one of my first memories of the beer community was being in Germany, a long time ago, and seeing a glass of Hefeweizen go by in a beer garden, and just everyone's head turns when that happens. It's such a remarkable moment. There's nothing more attractive than that. So haze is beautiful, but then when you see some of the murky, at some of these other beer gardens where the sun is coming through and it hits that glass of hazy IPA and then just dies because it's so murky, that's a sad sort of circumstance, and it's not one I'm too crazy about. But I think the style is incredibly popular. I think it's very accessible. Anybody who is not even really a craft beer fan, they're not assaulted by bitterness. There isn't any kind of lingering taste. A lot of them are very sweet, which is very built for the American palate. So I think they're here to stay. I just think they're kind of boring. I'd like to see them, be a little bit more interesting on the whole. But in that when we get into some of the fruited ones and the lactose, that's I hope those die a quick death. But also people love these sweeter beers. So we'll see. But I think they're sticking around.
Yeah, I agree with you on that front. But I also agree, like we said earlier, that there's a time where you probably can taste a bunch of hazy IPAs and milkshakes, and maybe not even know which one's which, to be honest with you sometimes. So, for me, a true milkshake IPA has that sweetness in it. They doesn't necessarily have the same perspective on a hazy. So it's all about the haze craze, especially where you're located in Boston, sandwiched between two of the largest two breweries out there from a hazy IPA perspective, Treehouse and Trillium. It's got to be refreshing every once in a while to have a nice lager or a Pilsner or something along those lines. I grew up in Framingham, Massachusetts, so one of my favorite claims of fame is that the town I grew up in is world-class lagers from Jack Abbey's, which is a great brewery over there from a different in perspective from the haze craze. So we'll see what happens with that trend, but I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon.
No, and I'm hoping. I've been saying lager is going to happen for the better part of 20 years now, and it's suddenly starting to happen a little bit. But I'm not going to sit here and joke with everyone and tell them that lager is definitely overtaken all the haze craze or anything like that. But I think that everyone is starting to, especially with COVID, starting to go back to beers that are a little bit more traditional, a little bit more comfort food. And I think lagers are certainly benefiting from that. We have breweries that have a little bit more time that they can take with their beers to produce them. So I'm here for the lager revolution, whether it's this year or 20 years from now. And in the meantime, American brewers are making some beautiful lagers, and I'm here to drink all of them.
That's fantastic. Well, if you joined us late, we're talking to Andy Crouch, the co-founder and publisher of The Beer Edge. It's a digital podcast all about beer. We want to get some good questions to Andy to get him on the hot seat there. So use Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube to ask those questions. We'd love to put someone on the screen and ask him there. So let's put up one right now. This one is from Drew Matthews, not Dave Matthews, but it'd be fun if it was Dave Matthews. If you had one beer to drink for the rest of your life, what would it be? These are the questions I love asking. Yeah, people get so upset, like, oh, come on. It's like asking what kid is your favorite from that perspective. But what beer on the top of your tongue would probably be like, I could live with this beer, drinking it all day, every day for the rest of my life?
The funny thing is, I have always thought before I had a kid that if somebody asked you, it's like asking about your favorite kid. And I'm not someone who has two kids, but I feel like you would have a favorite kid. Because like one of your kids is inevitably a bigger jerk than the other one, or like loves your wife or your partner or your spouse better than you. I think I could definitely pick between my kids. And so that makes this a much easier situation. I have long loved Victory Prima Pils. That is a beer that you almost never see anymore, but that was a fantastic one. And I think if I had to have one beer that I would drink for the rest of my life, it could either be a beer called The Standard from Notch Brewing, again in Salem, Massachusetts. It's just a beautiful, clean Czech-style lager, or Augustiner Helles. These are just beautiful beers that it doesn't. I mean, the knock on lager is that it is boring. It's not very interesting. It's because it doesn't hit you over the head. It's something that has subtlety, but also depth. These beers are beautiful. They're complicated. They're not that easy to make. They take talent. There's nowhere to hide. People need to spend some time with them. And I think that if it's on a hot day and you just want something that cleanses the palate, those types of beers are perfect. If it's a cold day and you want something to like ruminate over, they also provide that. So for me, those kind of beers are the ones that I would gravitate towards and would be happy living out the rest of my days just drinking any one of those three.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that gets lost a lot, we talk about the haze craze here, is just the return to the OG styles of beer, the lagers, the pilsners, the Czech pilsners, German pilsners. I had a great Czech pilsner yesterday from a brewery here in Connecticut called Marlowe's Ales, which brews out of 12% North Haven. And it's refreshing. We all love the haze craze. I mean, even if we say we don't, we do like it. It's great beer, but changing it up and trying those pilsners is completely refreshing. It's almost like revisiting that first beer you ever had. And I think it's a pretty interesting perspective there. And I totally agree with it from that perspective there. Here's another great question that popped up here. Andy, what is the trend in contemporary brewing that you wish was less prevalent?
I think we may have already covered it, but for me, it is really any beer. Well, frankly, I don't know. Is it any beer? Yeah, I'd go so far as any beer. Any beer brewed with lactose.
Yeah.
I'm just garbage. They are just garbage beers from start to finish. And I end up, whenever I'm in a new brewery, and the bartender comes over, the server comes over, and I end up panicking because I'm one of those people who just spends all their time looking at the list and never ordering. I've got friends, and John Hall's one of them, who's just he orders a standard, a simple standard lager or Kolsch, and he calls it his basically his menu sipping beer. So it's just it's the beer that you drink while you're actually looking at the menu to figure out what you're going to drink next. But I panic and end up ordering some cherry lactose, IPA, and it's just this is awful. So that is anything, even in imperial stout, darker beers, lactose for me is kind of garbagey. One of the things that has happened during COVID is I, along with a lot of other people, have spent a lot of time going through my cellar, and my cellar dates back. Like I said, I've been doing this a while. My cellar dates back a long time, not because I'm so amazing at keeping beers. It's because you forget about them. When back in the day, beer writers used to tell us you should cellar beers, and cellar beers like Sierra Nevada Celebration, which is another beer that if I was lost on an island,
I agree with you. That's a good one.
For the end of my days, I had a campaign early in COVID to get Sierra Nevada to actually make that year round. I don't know why we need to wait for that. Come on, we're all stuck in our houses. Give the people what they want, Sierra Nevada.
Agree.
Come on, Ken. But until that happens, we'll see what we can do. But that is a style that I'm not crazy about. But you go back through that cellar and you drink imperial stouts that were made 10 years ago or more, and they're just such a radically different experience from what you have now in the pastry stout and that whole style. And I can drink about an ounce or two of that, and I'm all set. But those are just not. I like beers that I can spend some time with, over a few rounds, preferably in good company. So beers that are made with those kind of ingredients, just they're not for me. But as I said, if you love those, great. You drink what you want. I'm not here to harsh on anybody's what their preferences are. But for me, they're pretty garbagey. So,
well, it's a good question, and we did talk about that earlier. I want to kind of shift a little gears here. We talked a little bit about Beer Edge before with John Hall when he came on a while ago, but I'd also would love to hear a little bit about, if people have never heard before, a little about what Beer Edge is and what your goals are for this particular podcast. Because we all know, if you're in the beer industry, there's probably a handful, dozen or so beer podcasts all around there. What makes Beer Edge so different and so enthralling to listen to?
So my partner, John Hall, and I have been covering the beer trade for, like I said, about 20 years each. And so we've gone around the world. We've talked to brewers all over. This is not something that's new for us. And at our heart, we are craft beer fans. We love these products. We're not, we're not just here to write about business. We're not just here to write about product and SKUs and things like that and distribution, though all of those are fascinating topics. We love the product at our heart. And so for us, we are trying to talk to, there's a lot of business related publications in the craft beer industry, and they tend to focus on more large business issues. We are trying to focus on things that are a little bit more important day to day for, maybe the 9,000 smaller breweries in this country. Most of the beer in this country is made by, 50 or 100 different breweries, but the rest of the country is where, these smaller brewers really thrive and really bring a lot of interest to their local community. So Beer Edge is a business newsletter, subscription-based newsletter. You can go to beeredge.com to learn more. And on that, for what we're doing is we are, doing the newsletter, which is subscription for, that covers these issues for the industry. But also John and I both do our own individual podcast. John's is Drink Beer, Think Beer, comes out every Wednesday. I do a podcast that's just uninspiredly called the Beer Edge Podcast. It comes out usually on Monday or Tuesday, depending on, I have Sunday night trivia with friends, depends on how late that goes. Sometimes we get a little delayed, but we, on this podcast, we talk to some fascinating people in the industry, and we talk to them in depth, and we ask questions that we think a lot of other people don't. We're not sitting there just asking how many barrels your brewery does a year or how many states you distribute in. We're really trying to get into the individual stories behind the people. And, we are passionate about the products. We think it comes through in our work. And we've talked to some really, really great folks over the last couple of years. So if you're interested, we're at Beer Edge Podcast or Drink Beer, Think Beer. Can be found on any podcast app out there. So please join us. And if you have any questions, you can get at us through the Beer Edge website, or we are at the Beer Edge on Insta, on Twitter, name it.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy the work that you do. Not just saying that because you had me on your podcast, but I think it's some great conversations that you guys had with people in the industry right now that really need to be told. You had Bob from the Brewers Association on as well. We had Julia, which was on our show earlier, talking about her transition. I think one of the things that sets you guys apart is that you ask the tough questions and you make it in a way where people can actually hear what's going on and not just, like you said, how many barrels are you guys making, how many users do you guys have, etc. It's a great story to be able to hear that from start to finish. So I highly recommend it if you're looking for a new beer podcast to pick up, to check those out from that perspective.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I've been at this long enough that I don't necessarily, I agree that, there is a communal aspect to craft beer, and I think it's a wonderful thing. It has changed and mutated over the years, and that's a fascinating thing to watch and to cover. But for me, I have sort of, both of us have journalism backgrounds. John worked at the New York Times. I've written for magazines for a long time. We spend time before our interviews thinking about the questions we want to ask. We don't just get on there and BS with people. And so we structure our questions in a way that hopefully leads to some interesting conversations. And I would say, we've certainly had quite a few interesting conversations in recent months, and hope to have many more. But if you have folks out there in the Untapped community that you think, you have folks that you think we should be talking to, send them my way. I'm at Beer Scribe on Twitter. And my DMs are open. I'm happy to hear from anybody, or send me an email.
Sounds great. We also have Max here, said listens to both your podcasts. I'm enjoying it a lot. Keep up the good work. So I'm happy to hear that. I'm sure you are as well, Andy. But thanks, Matt, for the note there. Let's have a few more questions here. This one's from Greg, and it's a great name, Greg Ginsberg. Appreciate it. Do you feel that barrel-aged high beers take on many complexities similar to wine? And do you prefer a way to sample them so you can savor all their nuances?
I am someone who I don't drink a ton of high ABV beers. I have a bunch in my house, but it's almost like, especially these days when almost everything comes in a 16-ounce pounder can, even 12% barley wine and what have you. It's not something I spend a ton of time drinking. Like I said, I drink a lot of lager. I drink a lot of low ABV beer because I think that is a really fascinating area. But I also, for many, many, many years, either worked at or attended the Extreme Beer Fest that Beer Advocate put on. As I said, I was a columnist there for a long time. Have known the Alstroms for a very long time. And so I've had, thousands of these types of beers. The way I like to drink them, and I think some of these, barrel-aged stuff can be really fascinating, especially if they're not over-adulterated. If you've added, more than 3 different ingredients of specialty ingredients, it tends to get washed out, tends to get lost. I like to see what the brewer's intent was with the beer, and to see how that changes a little bit over time. So for me, I like to sit with a beer, especially one of these high alcohol ones, over a period of a couple hours. And I know that may seem a little crazy to some people, but it's you get a decent snifter, and all of us have that glassware, particular piece of glassware that we love. And I have an old Dogfish Head, snifter that I use for anything along those lines, and it just looks like an old brandy snifter. And I use that thing, and I will take a few sips, step away from it for half an hour, go do something else, come back to it, just leave it on the kitchen table, see how it's changed. And that's the way I really like to see how it goes and see how it changes over time and over even a couple of hours as it warms up. But I think, a lot of the beers that people are making these days are absolutely fascinating. But more than anything, I love seeing what the brewer's intent is.
Yeah, those are very complex beers for sure. And it's always about, I appreciate the aspect that you say about kind of warming it up in a sense and having it over time. I think that you get way more flavors when you kind of take it from that perspective. We see some Untapped all the time. The higher the ABV, the higher the rating. So it's just a kind of a perception that people have is, I have a 14.4 in front of me. This is going to be amazing. And I think if you kind of step back for a second, enjoy that from a longer period of time, as opposed to just drinking like a normal lager, obviously you're going to be standing up faster and you're going to be able to walk and you're not going to be able to falling down, but you're going to feel a lot more from a perspective of just understanding the flavors into it. So good perspective there. Let's go to a couple more questions here. This one is a great question from Erica. It says, what do you recommend a good gluten-free beer? This is definitely a tough question, so hopefully you have a good answer for this one.
I do, because Erica is a very good friend of mine who lives in Minnesota, and we have traveled to quite a few gluten-free breweries. She is celiac, not to put her business out there on the lawn, but she, I have long been one of my worst nightmares is the inability to consume beer. And I don't drink a ton, and I used to not drink a ton at home until COVID, but for friends who have unfortunately either through dietary or medical reasons are unable to consume gluten, or as part of their diet, they just choose not to, the beers that used to be produced like Anheuser-Busch's Redbridge and things like that were well intended, but atrocious. They were they weren't beer in any respect that you would smell, look at, or taste. They were terrible, and it was kind of like O'Doul's with non-alcoholic beer, which I think non-alcoholic beer is the final frontier, and low alcohol beer is the final frontier of brewing. I'm so curious to see where that goes. But for gluten-free beer, I think the biggest step that was taken forward, and this is not truly gluten-free, but really gluten-reduced under something like 10 parts per million, was Omission. And I think Omission, their lager, if you fed that to me on any given day, I would not know that this was a gluten-reduced
100%
beer.
agree. Yeah, it's a great beer.
The IPA, at least the pale back in the day, a little less so. But I think a lot of breweries were doing gluten-free. I think the non-alcoholic thing may have swallowed that niche a little bit, but gluten-free, there's and I do not recall the name of it, but there's a great gluten-free brewery that I've been to with Erica in St. Paul, Minnesota, that produces some good stuff. And I think, I really would encourage brewers to give some thought to, I love breweries that try to make themselves available to cast as wide a net for the populace as they can. They shouldn't just have 13 hazy IPAs on. They should have some beer for everybody. And to the extent that you can have either non-alcoholic or gluten-free beer available, something that tastes and smells and reminds somebody of beer. If you are a beer lover and you cannot consume gluten, that is just such a strike at your heart of who you are and who you want to be and the enjoyment you have with people. And so a good gluten-free beer, can be made with some odd ingredients and taste, be a curiosity, almost an extreme beer, and that's fascinating. But ones that can convince you that you're actually drinking real beer. Same thing with non-alcoholic beer. That I think you're doing the Lord's work if you can achieve that. And I applaud. So I've written a lot about gluten-free beer over the years because I have good friends who have this issue, and I think they should be able to sit next to me at a pub or in a brewery and enjoy a pint next to me.
I totally agree. One of my good friends has celiac, so he actually got diagnosed halfway through his beer kind of exploration. So I think it's one thing to not be able to do it from birth or what have you, and not understand the flavors. But then going through having all the great beers and having to stop has got to be the worst thing in the world. I think that's why there's a lot of. I agree with you. I think that's why hard seltzers is also becoming more of a popular thing because they're gluten free as well. And if you're a big fan of kind of carbonated beverages, it fits for that need. But I know him for a fact. We would love to sit down at a brewery and he has to order a cider or something. Yeah. If there's no other option, and I know that he wants to have a good quality beer. So I'm with you. Hopefully that we'll be able to kind of cross that boundary.
My friend Erica reminds me that brewery in St. Paul is Burning Brothers. For those of you who are in the cities.
There you go. Very cool. Well, Andy, thank you so much for being part of the show tonight. We really appreciate your insights here. It's awesome to kind of interview you as you interviewed me and flip the table here. So it's kind of an interesting perspective. But I want to give you an opportunity to kind of give any last minute plugs for yourself, where people can find you on the internet, or anything else that you want to share at this point.
Sure. I think the world of beer journalism is worth supporting. And I think now more than ever, we need to get out and support these local breweries, whether that's, visiting them, especially if they do, COVID and, safety, well, then get out and support them or get some takeaway beer from them, buy gift certificates, do what you can do to support your local brewery. But beer journalism as well, I think is important. I think that it helps support the industry and by covering all these different angles. And so if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what we do, we're at, like I said, at beeredge.com. We do updated, articles every week. We do a lot of podcasts, and I think there's just a lot of great stories out there. But I would encourage you to, either go onto our social media at the Beer Edge, or go to the website beeredge.com. Or like I said, reach out to me if you have people I think we should be covering, because right now we're not able to travel. We're not able to get out. And that's something that I miss, getting out there and enjoying, coming into a new city and getting to experience the local bar culture, the local brewery culture. And it's going to be some time before we can do that. So you all out there are kind of the ambassadors and sort of the eyes and the ears on the ground for those of us who are covering the trade. So if you have people or brewers that you think are doing particularly good work, then please be in touch and let us know so that we can try to amplify those stories.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Andy. We appreciate you being on the show and enjoying your weekend.
Yes. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers, Andy. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for watching our virtual happy hour on this beautiful Thursday evening. We appreciate it. Hope you had a great time. Want to give you a little bit of an update on what's happening next week. We should have some really good guests as well. We're having Jackie Mallory, who is the Beardness, which is going to be more of a beer and food pairing next Tuesday. That is, I believe, the 1st of September, and that'll be at 7 p.m. as well. We'll have some great kind of recipes and things to work with there. Then on that Thursday, we're going to have Eugene Brown, a.k.a. the Black Beard Chick, as well, talking a little bit about her journey through beer and what she's discovered on her path to understanding how things work in the beer industry. So we're super excited to talk to her as well, again at 7 p.m. You can find all the schedule information at untapped.tv, and you can also listen to the podcast of all these shows on any podcast network that you'd like. We're available on there as well. If you have questions or feedback, and just like as Andy said, if you want to hear about somebody that we're talking to in the industry or a great story, let us know at media@untapped.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Cheers and have a great weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Cheers.